Right. I am Mike Tolliver, Executive Director for the Center of Hebraic Thought, and I am interviewing today Dr. Dru Johnson, the president and founder of the Center for Hebraic Thought, as well as the Templeton Senior Research Fellow with Wycliffe Hall, University of Oxford. Dru, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today about your book, What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture? And you and I had a chance to talk a little bit about that beforehand, but the thing that really stood out to me was that you think this book is an excellent example of applying Hebraic thought to a modern question. So talk a little bit about why is that true? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's funny. Lots of my friends, scholar friends, ask me. They're like, I said, "Oh, I'm putting out this book on Darwin." They're like, "What? Why are you writing on Darwin?" And the answer is simple. To me, it's a case study of Hebraic thought, right? And I've been making all of these claims that the biblical authors had all kinds of sophisticated thoughts about things, even things that maybe they don't talk about directly, but have direct implications for things that we care about today. And so for the conference, I was working on this issue of natural selection in Darwin, and it just occurred to me that the very things that Darwin talks about in natural selection, scarcity of resources that leads to violent competition, sexual propagation being one of the top goals of any kind of creature, right? And then the one who can sexually propagate in that scarce environment is the one who fits to that they fit the niche well, right? They fit the environment. And it just hit me like, oh, it's Genesis 1 through 11. That's all they talk about. And I even went further, I researched it more for the book and said, oh, it's not only all they talk about, but, nobody else in the ancient world puts these three things in conversation like until Darwin and Wallace, depending on how you count those things. I couldn't find anywhere in the gap where anybody besides Genesis 1 through 11 and Darwin put them in conversation. I've later had somebody point out to me that there's probably a reason for that, or at least there's a reason why Darwin put those three things in conversation as well. So the question is, okay, the biblical authors, if I were to put it in Darwinistic terms, they have their own view of natural selection. They have their own view of what causes scarcity and why, and what the appropriate and inappropriate responses to scarcity are. And what it means to be a creature in an environment. And sexual propagation plays a huge role in their lives. It actually, and not just sex, but the actual generating of future descendants, right? And not just, and it's a really, until I started working on this book, I didn't realize how interesting what the biblical authors was doing was. I just thought of it like, oh yeah, you want to have children. Well, no, actually, the biblical authors want you to have children and grandchildren and great grandchildren and great 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 grandchildren, and their focus is on those children, those great 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 children that you'll never meet, but will inherit the blessings of all the work you're doing right now. Which that shift in focus really kind of, like any kind of shift in focus where you raise your eyes and look over the horizon, that changes everything you do right now. So all I did is just put them in direct conversation. Okay, they're basically talking about very similar topics. They have very similar arrangement between these three moving parts: scarcity, fit, and propagation. And I just said, okay, well, where do they overlap in their thinking, and where do they conflict with each other? And I found really interesting points of overlap and deeper conflicts than I could have ever imagined between those two views.
And so you mentioned in the book the two conceptual worlds that you're working with here. Could you describe those a little bit?
Yeah, there's actually three, to be honest. So there's the conceptual world. How do the biblical authors deal with these issues of natural selection, right? And again, natural selection is not evolution. It's the one that even if you're a 7-day creationist, natural selection shouldn't be a controversial thing for you. You can see it today in the world of nature, which is what we are all inhabiting. And then I look at Darwin's view, how he deals with natural selection, and then I look at later evolutionary science. So current evolutionary science over the last 150 years, where have they critiqued Darwin? Where might they critique the biblical view, or where they might align better with the biblical view of natural selection? And so for me, again, this was a surprising journey of not only do the biblical authors have something to say about natural selection, they actually have their own conceptual scheme for it that you can just put in direct conversation. Okay, anyways, I could go on for a long time about the particulars, but I'll spare.
And so then, for those folks that do a lot of work with Darwin, how has this book been received?
Yeah, so far, I mean, it's only a year out, which in scholarly terms is very early, right? The reviews usually come after a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 or 4 years. So it's a slow burn. I always tell pastors it's like preaching to a congregation with their backs turned to you, blindfolded and headphones on all of them, right? And then later they'll read the transcript, if they feel like it. So
While you're still alive,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
you just
right.
don't get a lot of feedback initially. So, but my scientist friends who've read it are very intrigued by it. There's been one review by a historian of science who said like, yeah, this is very interesting and I buy it. And then he explained, I thought it was just a coincidence that Darwin and the biblical view seemed eerily similar to each other. And he says, no, actually, there's a lot of scholarship, which I somehow missed, that showing that probably Darwin was consciously and subconsciously, his thought was infused with lots of biblical narrative. I pointed out a few of these. I mean, he uses the tree of life to show the pruning of life, right? He speaks almost in Edenic terms. And so he trained to be a minister in Cambridge, right? So it's not surprising that a lot of those metaphors from scripture are going to bleed into what he's saying and thinking. But yeah, so it's been surprisingly good. I'm sure somebody's going to hate it out there, and that's fine. But so far, I've been pleasantly surprised that nobody has said this is total rubbish. It makes no sense, and it's horrible writing. That's the real fear I have. Is they're going to say his writing is horrible.
Well, thank you for putting that out there and kind of conveying a little bit more to us directly how that is an example of the application of Hebraic thought. And I'm actually excited to see more examples of that in future writings. And
Yes,
so,
of other people who know more what they're talking about than me. So yes, like I mean, that's the real goal is to say, okay, if you can do this with Darwin and natural selection, what else can you do this with, right? And I think there's a lot to be explored. So it's kind of open, fertile ground for scholars to explore at this point.
well, thank you so much.